Think back a couple of weeks. Think back to cooking Christmas dinner. How does it happen in your family? Is your household one where somebody writes down a timetable of events and things are carried out with military precision? Or is it a bit chaotic, so that somebody says, oh well, we'll eat after the Queen's been on at 3:15, but you actually end up eating at 6 o'clock? Either way, there's a period in the middle of preparing dinner which I'd call the messy middle. It's the stage where somebody walking into the kitchen would look around and say, well, there's a gorgeous smell of turkey cooking, there's a pile of sprouts over there, there's a bunch of potatoes boiling in a pan, there's carrots in another place, there's stuff that needs clearing up, there's no sign of stuffing or bread sauce or cranberry sauce, let alone gravy. What in the world is going on? And the person who's cooking could reasonably respond, well, of course it looks messy, I'm not finished yet. And a few hours later, when the food appears on the table, they'd say, well, you see, I told you I wasn't finished earlier. Now everything's ready. That's how our lives often are, isn't it? We often find ourselves living in the messy middle. We do something and we don't know quite how it'll work out. We can find ourselves saying later, well, I wasn't expecting that. Whether it's a good or a bad outcome or just something different to what we expected. Now that's true for those of us who follow Jesus too. Things can happen that knock us for a loop and we wonder what in the world God is doing. There might be a bereavement or a job lost, or starting a job that doesn't turn out at all as we expected, or moving house, or kids hitting a difficulty at school, or needing to make important choices about the subjects, or retirement. And all those things are true in normal time, aren't they? But they're even more true at the moment in the midst of this wretched pandemic and the lockdown we're currently experiencing. Have you ever thought that the stories in the Bible are like this too? When we read stories like the story of Ruth and Naomi, it's often only at the end that we see what's really going on. And it's common that there's a messy middle where people go into a situation unsure of what God's going to do and only see later what's really going on. Indeed, sometimes you can get things that go on that are never clear and never finished in the person's lifetime. Think of the Old Testament prophets who spoke about a coming king and didn't know that it was going to be hundreds of years later that Jesus would be the true fulfillment of what Isaiah or Zechariah or the others had spoken. Or think of the words of the angels to the disciples of Jesus at his ascension. They say to them, this Jesus who's departed will come back in the same way. But they didn't live to see that. We haven't lived to see it yet. As we read the book of Ruth together over the next few weeks, we're going to see lots of messy middle. Ruth, Naomi and Orpah dealing with the shock of triple bereavement away from Naomi's home country. Naomi saying that she's a bitter woman. Naomi and Ruth back in Bethlehem but unable to support themselves. What's God up to in the midst of all this? That's the big question, and it's a question that the book of Ruth does answer. So today we're going to look at a big picture, an overview of the book. We're going to look at when and where it all happens, the cast of characters, and how the author tells the story. Let's start with when and where. The very first words of the book tell us when. In the days when the judges ruled. The whole story is set in the period covered by the book of Judges in the Old Testament, which is the book immediately before Ruth in our Old Testament. So it's been located between the return to the land from Egypt, led by Moses and Joshua, and the rise of the kings of Israel, Saul, David, Solomon, that 1 and 2 Samuel tell us about. That's between about 1400 BC and 1100 BC. It's the period that we know in archaeology as the Iron Age. It was a chaotic time, as the book of Judges says, a time when, as Judges twice says, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Faithfulness to God was low, and that led to invasions and wars and all sorts of strange things going on. And the author's looking back on that period. There are two things that show us that that's what's going on. In chapter 4 verse 7, when Boaz is doing a deal, a business deal at the gate where the men meet, he explains a custom. Our author tells us that it was the custom in those days that when you made an agreement, you took off your sandal and handed it to the other person. Presumably because the author thinks that his readers won't get this, so he's writing at a later date. The other clue is in chapter 4 verse 16, where we get the descendants of Boaz and Ruth listed. And we discover from this that Ruth is King David's great-grandmother. That means that the author's writing at least during the time of King David, which is more than 100 years after these events, and quite possibly later still. So that's when. Where? Well, the story involves a journey from Bethlehem to Moab and back. Have a look at this map to see that. Elimelech and his wife Naomi live in Bethlehem in Judah. You can see that over at the left-hand side. And they travel because of a famine to Moab on the opposite side of the Dead Sea. We're not sure whether they'd have travelled north of the Dead Sea or south, because the book doesn't tell us where in Moab exactly they went to. So the journey's somewhere between 45 and 90 miles. And they settle down there, and chapter 1 verse 4 tells us that they lived there for at least 10 years. Now tragically, while they're there in Moab, Elimelech dies, verse 3, and Naomi's two sons die, Mahlon and Chilion, verse 5, and they've got married to local Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then Naomi hears in verse 6 that food has now appeared again in her home area of Judah. So she decides to travel back. And chapter 1 tells the rest of the story of this journey. We'll look at that in more detail next time. So we've got a journey from Bethlehem across to Moab and then back. And Naomi and Ruth return to Bethlehem. And there we discover that this is a farming community. In chapter 2, Ruth goes gleaning in the fields and is able to glean, that is to pick up bits of uncut corn that the harvesters have left. In chapter 3, Ruth goes to meet Boaz at a winnowing floor, which was a place where you'd throw the chaff and the grain up into the air so the wind would blow the chaff away and the heavier grain would fall to the ground. It was a way of sorting the two out. And then in chapter 4 verse 1 we meet the town gate where the elders meet and where men do business. So Bethlehem's a farming community in tune with its name, because the name Bethlehem means house of bread.